Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Strangers in Jerusalem podcast and YouTube channel, where we explore the Gospels and the Jesus traditions within their Jewish context. We know from the last video that these texts were written in a certain place, in a certain generation, and we're going to explore the different factors, the phenomenon, and the politics of that generation to help us put these Gospels within their broader context. In this particular video, we are going to look at the first major factor of how these Gospels were written and what influenced them. So follow me. Let's go to Jerusalem. The first issue, Jewish-Roman relations. The second factor that influenced the Gospels is intra-Jewish conflict, which means that there are Jewish people, different types of Jews, fighting with each other. And in this case, there were Jewish followers of Jesus and other subsets of Jews that were fighting. Professor James Dunn, he's an emeritus professor of New Testament at the University of Durham, explained it this way, and I'll put this quote up here on the screen. And we'll walk through this carefully to see how he lays out this argument, this theory. Here's what he says. The complexity of John's treatment of the Jews, we see the Jews all throughout John's gospel, the complexity of John's treatment of the Jews is best explained by the historical situation confronting the author of John. There is a large-scale consensus that John was writing at around the end of the first century, during the period after the destruction of the temple, when the rabbis/Pharisees began the lengthy process of rebuilding the nation. And they did this around the Torah, and of defending Judaism more carefully in the face of other claimants to the heritage of Second Temple Judaism, including Christianity. Okay, still follow me? In these circumstances, it is very likely that John's usage of the Jews, meaning the Jewish authorities, not all Jews everywhere, but the Jewish authorities, this refers to a local Jewish leadership who identified with the objectives of the rabbis. But it is also likely that John's usage reflects the claim beginning to be made at that time by the rabbis to be the only legitimate heirs to pre-70 Judaism, to be in fact the Jews. At the same time, however, there were other ethnic Jews who must have been caught in the middle, the heirs of a much more diverse forms of late Second Temple Judaism, caught between the competing claims of the rabbis and others, and including the believers in. Okay, several elements in the Gospel of John might support this theory. So if we take Professor Dunn's theory, and many other scholars subscribe to this, if we take certain elements in the Gospel of John, we can see how this theory is displayed in the Gospel. So one example is that we find encounters in the Gospel of John between the disciples of Moses and the disciples of Jesus. There's one case where Jesus heals a blind man, and this blind man was reviled by some Jews for being Jesus' disciples, if you remember the story. And they say, you're a disciple of Jesus, not a disciple of Moses, like themselves, like the Jews. This is at John 9:28. So that's kind of interesting that you have people saying, oh, you're disciples of Jesus and not disciples of Moses, meaning you're not a Jew. Elsewhere, Jesus reproved his Jewish opponents. He chastised them, and when he said, quote, you do not have the love of God in you, and you have set your hope upon Moses, but you should believe in me. So here in John 5, this is John 5:41 through 46, this entire dialogue, Jesus is setting himself up as an opponent or as another option in contradistinction to Moses. He says, you're following Moses, but you should follow me. In the next episode, the author of John seems to downplay Moses again. And it says in John chapter 6, then Jesus said to them, verily, truly, I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Then the Jews began to complain about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. There seems to be some identity contest in these passages that does not fit any early first century setting in relation to Jesus' movement. In these passages, we see Jesus and his disciples presented in contradistinction to Moses and his disciples, who are portrayed as Jews. rather than Jesus and Moses portrayed as two important members of the same team. In the early first century, Jesus and his followers were likely not seen as outsiders to Judaism. So these passages are kind of strange, where Jesus is setting himself up, at least according to the author of John, as a different leader, a different option for Jews and for Moses. So the material, some of that material is confusing in the Gospel of John. This rhetoric does fit, however, within a late first century setting when Jewish Christianity was becoming increasingly Gentile in its population and in its proselyting focus. So if Dr. Dunn is right, that there's this, and if a lot of scholars who subscribe to this are right, that there's these competing factors after the temple is destroyed and when Judaism needs to be reinvented and the Jewish identity needs to be refocused after the destruction of the temple, there's all these different Jewish groups trying to define Judaism. And within the struggle, this is when the Gospel of John, some of these elements, this is when this makes sense, where Jesus is saying, you're following Moses, but you should follow me, okay? Here's another example. John refers to your law. The author of John refers to, quote, your law, as if he's an outsider to Judaism. The author of John. This is John 8:17, John 10:34. Here's one specific example in John 9:22. Quote, the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confesses Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. In John 12 says, nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him, in Jesus. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess it for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. Also in John 16, I have said these things to you to keep you from stumbling. They, Jesus is saying this, they, the Jews, will put you out of the synagogue. They'll kick you out of the synagogue. Or in other words, they'll kick you out of Judaism, of the Jewish system. Indeed, an hour is coming when those who kill you will think that by doing so, they are offering worship to God. So this is very strong rhetoric that pits Jesus and his disciples against Jews and that they'll throw you out of the synagogue. It seems strange that Jesus would use this language as a synagogue attending first century Jew and his disciples. We know that they attended synagogues. The Gospel of Matthew is a similar text that seems, when we read it, it seems to be responding to conflicts in the late first century between Jewish Christians and other groups of Jews. We find that same dynamic. These texts were written after the destruction of the temple, after Jews and Romans fought with each other and that whole situation. These Gospels were also written at a time when there were competing Judaisms in this age when Judaism is being redefined. And we see in the text some examples where the Gospel writers are pitting Jesus up against Jews. This wouldn't make sense in the early first century when Jesus even himself says, I have come to speak to Jews. I've come to teach Jews. He goes to synagogue. He goes to the temple. Even Paul, after Jesus' death, Paul continues to go to the temple and sacrifice. So these are Jews in every sense of the word. And so these passages seem to more reflect a period of time after Christianity had been seen as non-Jewish and more Gentile in focus. And so we have to understand it within that scenario.